All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are in the third part of the fifth chapter of the Our Canada textbook, British Conquest of North America. And the events that took place in this part of history are sometimes summarized as the 7 Years' War, or sometimes it's called the French and Indian Wars. It was basically Britain against France and a little bit of Spain, and they fought a war. It started in the Ohio Valley. It spread globally fairly soon thereafter. Winston Churchill is quoted as saying, "This was the first really, truly global war." Okay. In 1760, Britain seizes Quebec, and that's the end of the New France colony as we knew it. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris is signed, which seals the battle, which ends the battle, thankfully, and which gives New France to the Britons. Let's watch a short crash course video on this very topic.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss the events that led to the American Revolution. So we'll begin with the 7 Years' War, which, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, Winston Churchill referred to as the First World War. The Americans called it the French and Indian War. The Prussians called it the Third Silesian War. Swedes called it the Pomeranian War. For today, we're just going to call it the 7 Years' War on account of how it lasted for 9 years. So here at Crash Course, we take a broad view of history, and rather than talking about the minute details of wars, we try to focus on the important stuff. Causes, effects, anytime Vladimir Putin might show up, and teacup kittens. And as far as causes go, the 7 Years' War was really, like most wars, about economics. Mr. Green, is this economics class? Because I don't remember signing up for it. Yeah, this is economics class, me from the past. It's economics and religion and psychology and anthropology and astronomy and physics and ecology and literature. That's the great thing about history. You can't put the past into little boxes that you study for 50 minutes a day until the bell rings. You can't separate what happened from what people wanted and believed and valued. Right, so mercantilism was the key economic theory of the British Empire in the 18th century. Because while Adam Smith and David Ricardo were talking up free trade and economic liberalism by 1750, no one was really listening. Mercantilism was basically the idea that the government should regulate the economy in order to increase national power. This meant encouraging local production through tariffs and monopolies, and also trying to ensure a favorable balance of trade. And colonies were an awesome way to create this favorable trade balance because they both produced raw materials and bought back finished goods made from those raw materials. But for it to work, you always need more and more land, so you can have more raw materials and more colonists to buy finished goods. By the way, it's important to understand the centrality of slavery in this colonial economy. I mean, the most important colonial trade goods were tobacco and sugar, and both of those crops relied heavily on slave labor. And slaves themselves were a key trade good in the so-called triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the colonies. As one historian put it, the growth and prosperity of the emerging society of free colonial British America were achieved as a result of slave labor.
Right, and that's of course a very apt statement that all this success on one hand had a big but, and that was the downside and the drama caused in slavery.
So Britain's greatest rival in the 18th century was France. Like, on paper, the Spanish had a more significant empire in North America, and they'd certainly been there longer, but their empire was really sparsely populated. In fact, by 1800, Los Angeles, the most populous town in Spanish California, had a population of 300 and only 17 freeways. The French colonies were considerably more populous, but even so, by 1750, there were only about 65,000 French colonists, most of them in the St. Lawrence River Valley, thereabouts. I don't know, maybe it was somewhere over here. This isn't a terribly detailed map, and also I'm not looking at it. But the French were moving into the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys and forming alliances with American Indians there to try to dominate the fur and deerskin trades, and that proved problematic. So wars usually have really complicated causes, and it's very rare that we can refer to one thing as making them inevitable. Fortunately, the 7 Years' War is the exception to that rule. Dan, I think I just used the word exception, which means it's time for a montage. I guess they heard there was an exception in town. So in 1749, the governor of Virginia awarded a huge land grant to something called the Ohio Company, which was basically a real estate development firm designed to benefit the governor of Virginia's friends. The Native Americans and their French supporters thought this was bad form because they thought they had rights to the land. So the Ohio Company asked the French to recognize their land claims, and the French were like, no! let's go to the thought bubble. The actual fighting began when the British, or more precisely British colonists, led by a 21-year-old militia colonel named George Washington, yes, that George Washington, tried to eject the French from the forts they were constructing in western Pennsylvania. The first attempt in 1754 was a disaster. Washington built and then abandoned the ironically named Fort Necessity, with the loss of 1/3 of his men. It was followed by the equally unsuccessful attack on Fort Duquesne, now located in downtown Pittsburgh, where the French and Indians pounded the British, killing 2/3 of General Braddock's forces and also General Braddock.
In this class, we will not focus very much on who captured which fort and all of that. But do note, yes, they fought about these forts that were inland, these trading posts / forts. They fought about it quite a bit.
Things didn't go much better for the British for the next 2 years, although they did take control of part of Nova Scotia and kick out more than 11,000 French Acadians, many of whom died in what is called the Expulsion. Some of those who didn't ended up in Louisiana and became Cajuns. But anyway, the tide began to turn for the British in 1759 when they captured French forts Duquesne, finally, Ticonderoga, and Louisbourg. The biggest victory of all came in September, when the British trounced the French at the Plains of Abraham near Quebec. Montreal surrendered the next year. The rest of the battles aren't that important unless you were fighting in them, and I'm sure you can count on the French and Indian War aficionados to fill the gaps in comments, but suffice it to say that the British were victorious in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and as far away as India. The war continued officially for 3 more years and ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the most obvious result of the war was territorial changes, particularly in the green areas of not America. And even though Britain won the war, they arguably got the short end of the territorial stick. Under the terms of the Peace of Paris, Britain got Canada from France and Florida from Spain. In return, France got Guadeloupe and Martinique, Caribbean sugar islands that were much more valuable, at least monetarily, than Canada. Sorry, Canada, but if you want to be valuable, grow some sugar. And not sugar beets either, Canada. Real sugar. And Spain got Cuba with its awesome sugar trade, and the Philippines with its proximity to China, which were much more valuable than Florida. I mean, at the time, Florida did not even have Disney World. Instead, it had yellow fever. But the real losers of the war were not the British or the Spanish or the French, but the Native Americans. The shuffling of territories meant the French were out of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, and the American Indians were stuck with the British, who kind of sucked. And as the British moved west, Native Americans felt compelled to fight back. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. If I'm wrong about...
We will fast forward just to here. Although he does get shocked, which proves to be painful but not fatal.
Fine. Gah! So after the end of the 7 Years' War, American Indians organized an armed revolt. In 1763, Indians, particularly from the Ottawa and Delaware tribes, launched what has come to be known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, of course, the rebellion ultimately failed to dislodge the British, but the Native Americans did manage to besiege Detroit and kill hundreds of settlers. And that convinced the British that if they wanted to avoid future conflicts, they should slow down the colonist settlements into the territories. So the British Parliament issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbids settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and reserved that territory for Indians. Now that sounds like a sensible policy until you remember that the British colonists had just finished fighting a war in order to get the right to move into that very territory. So the settlers duly ignored the Proclamation Line and got down to settling. The other big outcome of the 7 Years' War was that it set up the American Revolution. I mean, you've just seen colonists ignoring the British Parliament. We'll talk more about that next week, but around the end of the 7 Years' War, new ideas like republicanism were taking root in the colonies. Republicanism.
And that's where we'll pause it for now. On to the next slide. Ooh, there we are. Causes of the 7 Years' War. There were a couple of causes. American settlers ignored the territorial lines set by the British government and moved into the Ohio Valley. I would say this is an effect of the 7 Years' War. So remember that at the end of the 7 Years' War, they agreed on a line where the settlers could not move beyond because that was native territory. Yeah, the settlers ignored that. So it is a cause. Yeah, okay, there we go. It is a cause of the 7 Years' War, what came after it. Americans started changing their ideas about what government should be like, which led to the War of Independence, and we'll talk about that next chapter. And the 7 Years' War, after it, we also saw an increased freedom in people's religious experience, which is called the Great Awakening, and it was the first of 3. Let me see. So a good number of years ago, I read this book called American Jesus, and It's not like the song Personal Jesus. It talks about all the versions of Jesus, from macho Jesus to feminine Jesus to everything else, in American history, and how religion has changed. So what we saw in America in the 17 and 1800s were Christians that came from Europe, but in Europe they were established churches. So if you had a new idea, oh, let's do Christianity a little bit different, you'd be shut down pretty quickly, because there were all these established institutions, the churches, the Anglican Church in England, and they just wouldn't allow you. They were like, yeah, that's heresy, so get out. But
Wow.
when they came to America, they didn't have those existing institutions as strongly there as they had in England. So new ideas, new religious ideas, were much easier to start. You could just say, hey, okay, how about I start a new church? And so that's where evangelicalism comes from. Evangelicalism started in the minds of some Europeans, like really early on, the 1300s, these Moravians, John Wesley, who traveled to the Americas, the Plymouth Brethren from Plymouth in the United Kingdom.
Do we write that down?
Came to, I would say these are the extra details. They traveled to the United States with these new ideas and with these evangelical ideas. So Europe has a lot of Catholics and Protestants of the old stamp, if you will, and that's how I grew up as a Protestant in the Netherlands. So, you'd believe in God because, well, that's just what you do. Like you don't think about it. You definitely don't feel about it. If you feel anything, you go to the doctor. But if you talk to an evangelical, it'd be like, well, if you feel something, that might be God talking to you, which in my mind it's kind of funny, but that's what evangelicalism was all about. It's like, okay, we don't just believe because a book says and we follow the rules. We believe because God has spoken to us, and that's sometimes referred to as a conversion moment. When you're young, say in your teens or your 20s, and God speaks to you, and you say, okay, now I'm a born again Christian because I've had this intimate experience with God. And it was evangelical movements that pushed that kind of idea. They didn't have enough power to start that kind of Christianity in Europe, but they did in America. And these great awakenings were times in American history when Christianity experienced a sort of a renaissance, a boost, a moment of change. And so in American history, we see the birth of all kinds of forms of Christianity that we had not seen before in Europe, such as the evangelical stream, the Pentecostals, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormons, the Baptists to some degree. All of these find their roots somewhere in Europe, but really came to blossom in the United States in some of these great awakenings. And that shows you that one of the causes of the 7 Years' Wars is this newfound freedom of the colonies. They slowly started to break away from their European roots and become their own thing and become their own identity. All right, here we see a map. Okay, all these colonies. Red is Spain there. They were, of course, in South America and North America to some degree. Yes, and all these European countries, they pushed their identity onto these colonies where they were. Here, the Dutch in the East Indies, they didn't give that up until after the Second World War in the 1950s. That lots of colonial endings were not very pretty. And so here we are. When the 7 Years' War was over, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and the Treaty of Paris gave New France to Britain, except for two little islands, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. And to this day, these two islands off of the shores of Newfoundland are French territory. I'm sure you can pay with Canadian dollars there. But perhaps if you go there, you can also pay with euros. And I see a hand, Naya.
So what happened after the 7 Year War was that Paris got
Okay, so Paris signed a treaty, and what did that treaty do?
It was the Treaty of Paris, signed in the city of Paris by representatives of the British and the French government. France lost, and Britain got to have the spoils. And one of the things they got was New France. So Nova Scotia, Montreal, Quebec, they got to have that territory. But France wanted those two little islands. They said, you know what? There's a lot of codfish there. Can we keep those two islands? And that was okay.
Wait, could you go back, please?
And the decisive, I don't think we need to go back. And the decisive battle that swapped hands, where the colony became British, was fought at the Plains of Abraham. And here they are in their boats. Quebec is on a hill, and the cliffs from the St. Lawrence River are fairly steep. So here you see a lot of British soldiers trying to get up there, and you see the land battle on the Plains of Abraham. This is Quebec today. And there's the St. Lawrence River. The Fleuve Saint-Laurent. There we are. Here in the foreground, we see the old fort. You can see how steep these cliffs are. And, you know, these buildings weren't there, obviously.
Wow, so Anakin really did have the high ground. Well, Anakin is in Quebec.
Yeah. And here are the Plains of Abraham. And Abraham was just a farmer. So those were just his fields. So when they fought the battle there, they were like, okay, little sheepy sheep, go away now, because we're going to do bingity bangity boongity here. Okay. So here we are, a little bit.
Bangity boogity.
Yeah, well, the technical term. Yeah, okay, let's look at some war maps, some strategy maps. The red cannon here at the bottom of the image are British cannons. And this is where, for 3 months, as the textbook said, they were fired on Quebec. The British were camping out here too, kitty corner to Quebec. They tried to attack Beauport. Olivia, you mentioned that earlier. They tried to attack Beauport here, but there were trenches here. So the French were able to defend this. And then later, and that's the next image. I think I got all of that. Yeah. And then later, the British decided, okay, after having lost one attack on the city, they went here on the left side of this image and were able to get on land. And then in the morning of September 13, 1759, this battle that we saw in the video took place. And the British lined up too deep, which was a bit of an untypical strategy. It's called the thin red line. It allowed them to fire a little better. The French lost, and some of the French soldiers fled to Montreal for a potential second fight, but that didn't really happen as such. And the British took Quebec City. And here we see the death of Montcalm. Viscount Montcalm was the French leader, and he was shot in battle and by a bullet. And his horse brought him back to the city of Quebec after he was shot. He was still alive at that point, but he didn't survive his wounds. And here we see him. The man in the purple is the Bishop of Quebec.
Oh no.
But the British general also didn't survive. General James Wolfe here, dying on the battlefield. Very romantic picture, far more perfect than it looked, obviously. He was only in his early 30s when he died. What's that?
There's probably a lot more blood everywhere.
Yeah, there would be more blood. Well, it's how that flag is draped, and you know, the First Nation person here sitting, looking very attentively at this young man, this young general. After the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, French soldiers from Montreal attacked British soldiers from Quebec and defeated them in a small battle at Sainte-Foy in 1716. So, okay, sounds promising, but not so promising. The remainder of the British retreated behind the city walls of Quebec, and they stayed there for the winter, I would assume. Both sides waited for spring for military supplies from Europe. Both France and Britain had sent messages. We need more soldiers. We need more supplies if we're going to win this battle. And the question was, who is going to actually get those supplies? Will the British be sent supplies? Will the French be sent supplies? Both were sent supplies, but the French boats ran into bad weather and no extra soldiers came. The boats had to turn back to France. So Quebec had just been bombarded for 3 months. More than 1,000 farms along the St. Lawrence River had been burned by the British. And Governor Vaudreuil decided that was enough, and he decided to surrender New France. Now, when he returned to France, the king locked him up for a couple of weeks because he wasn't very happy that he gave up New France so easily, but Vaudreuil did. And so the Treaty of Paris was signed after the surrender. And so all 65,000 Canadians were now under British rule. And here you see the British soldiers marching through the street. Can you imagine, like, living in a city and being taken over by a different army, and you're like, oh, good, okay, so now we have different people in charge. Like, especially if they're foreigners, right? Say the Swedish people would, take over Canada and also.
Oh wait, go back one slide. I missed all of
Can
the
you
notes on that.
do it? Oh, all right.
Go back one slide, please. Thank you.
Yeah, can you imagine being taken over? It'd be so odd. Of course, my grandparents in the Netherlands had that happen to them when the Germans took over, and yeah, very few people liked it. People resisted it. World War II only took 5 years. But I imagine a lot of French were very unhappy with these new rulers, especially if they are like the enemy. Good. I saw the thumbs up. Thank you. British rule. And then we have Minwewe, an Anishinaabe leader. And he had to say this: Englishman, although you have conquered the French, you have not conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods, these mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to no one.
I think I'm gonna write that down.
Minwewe was together with Pontiac. And Pontiac, if I remember correctly, is an Ottawa chief, and Minwewe an Ojibwe chief. Both are of the Anishinaabe cultural group. Both of those tribes are Anishinaabe people of the Algonquin language tradition. So they probably speak very similar languages. And they stood up against the British. They're like, we're not having it. You might have conquered the French, but you ain't conquering us. And it weren't just words. There were skirmishes and battles. And Pontiac and Minwewe, but especially Pontiac, was a very skilled strategist, and they attacked quite a few forts, British forts. And sometimes they had a little bit of French help. And they attacked them to such a degree that the British was like, okay, we just fought a war. We don't have the energy to deal with these First Nations out. Let's just sign a peace with them, and let's move on. Let's not fight them. Fade, yeah.
Basically, the British did sign the treaty with the French, but they haven't signed it with the First Nations, which means that the First Nations actually hit them back.
Yes, they did.
Yes, because
Oh God, I'm cramping.
the French were part of them, and it's not easy to give up basically someone that like helped you to live or something.
Yeah.
Protected you and defended you.
Yeah,
So that's why they shot back and they fought back.
Yeah. Yeah. The First Nations there, the Anishinaabe groups, were much happier with the French, because the French were not as interested in the whole land grab game as the British colonists were. Yeah, the British colonists took way more land, and they saw that. Like, they talked to each other, and so they weren't very happy. They were like, "Oh shoot! Now the British took over. What's going to happen to our territory?"
What's a land grabbing mission?
Well, colonization. My
I know. I just thought you said it funny.
Thanks. Pontiac and Minuera. Here we see some of the forts they attacked. Where you see the little bushfire symbol, that's the fort they attacked. Quite a few. Yeah. And so in 1765, they signed an agreement that they would respect each other's territory. In 1963, before these wars, but right after the 7 Years' War, when the Treaty of Paris was signed, the British government gave a royal proclamation to the new province of Quebec. Basically, a document that says you are now a thing. You are now a colony, and here are your rules. The royal proclamation was quite strict. One thing it did is it divided where Indian and European territory was. So it gave the First Nations, quite a bit of space there in the green. But it did a couple of other things too. It created an assembly, like an elected government, although at least it promised it. It took 30 more years before that assembly was actually created. It introduced British common law and got rid of French civil law. And you got to understand that the law governs society, not just on which side of the road you drive, so to speak. But the seigneurial system they had in Quebec, do you remember those small strips of land with the houses and the road and the mill in the middle, and the seigneur, the rich guy, who would kind of foot some money but then control it all, and you had to get a tithe, like 1/10 of your income every year, to the church, so that whole central infrastructure could be supported. It's like taxes. The seigneurial system was part of French civil law. And when British common law came in, that went out of the door too. So they were frustrated that some of the institutions they had built in their colony couldn't exist anymore. And then the other negative thing is that the British said, "Oh, and by the way, if you're Catholic, you cannot be in government," which was all of them, all of those French people. They were all Catholics, pretty much, except for the odd Huguenot Protestant. But and so that was a little bit too strict. And what we saw was French people being angry about that. And at the same time, the people in the 13 colonies were getting angry with Britain. And Britain changed its tactic a little bit. It said, "Okay, hang on. If we don't want to lose this Quebec colony, let's try to be tactful. Let's give them a little bit of what they want." So they said, "Okay, you can have your French civil law back. And okay, if you are Catholic, that's okay now. And you can be in government too." So a few things were given back. And that was the Quebec Act 11 years later of 1774. The Quebec Act, however, also drew new lines for where First Nation territory was. However, this document, the Royal Proclamation, said any future decision about First Nation land should be made after consulting the First Nations that are involved. And so this Quebec Act comes by, and no one is consulted. None of the First Nations are consulted. So some of these original land claims that First Nations have today go back all the way to this Royal Proclamation of 1763, but it's like, because they said, well, in the original agreement we had from the British, this was said, and so therefore you got to honor that. And so that's why there's still court cases about this kind of stuff going on today. Okay, the Quebec Act of 1774. It gave a little bit more power to the French citizens. Look here, pretty pictures. What you see on the right is the seal of the Roman Catholic Church, the seal of the Pope. And what you see on the left is the crest of the British king. And these were the two forces at work in Quebec, which now under British control. Of course, the British were in
The
charge.
what of the British king? Sorry, it was the seal of the Pope and the flag
Seal
of the British king,
and the crest.
and the seal and the.
Well, we could. The other one's the crest too. Really, it's not a seal so much. It's a crest, I think. Crest, fancy word for logo. The king was in charge in Quebec. The British king was in charge, and he could say what happened. But all its citizens, pretty much all its citizens, were French, and so they were Catholic. And I've explained to you before what an important role the Catholic Church played in Quebec. And so these citizens would often look, well, they would listen to their priest just as much as they would listen to the policeman, so to speak. And especially since they've been conquered by this foreign power who they don't really like, they were much more inclined to listen to their priest than to listen to the British government. And they didn't mind ignoring the British government. But the priest got its instructions from the Bishop of Quebec, who got his instructions from the Pope in Rome. And these two forces of, okay, who do we listen to? Do we listen to the British king or the Pope in Rome? Have names. The force that in Quebec that said, oh, let's listen to the Pope, and sometimes the messages would be conflicting. Let's listen to the Pope is called Ultramontanism. And this is a bit of a, I don't know, this would be in one of the AC terms, right? Ultramontanism, ultra meaning over, and montan meaning mountain. So over the mountains, because there's mountains in Italy, the Alps. And so from our perspective, you'd go over the mountains, and that's where Rome is. So the idea of listening to the directions of the Pope in Rome is called ultramontanism. And the opposite of that, listening to the British king, would be called Gallicanism. And it was ultramontanism and Gallicanism that was at work in the identity of the people in Quebec, right? They had to ask themselves very serious questions about existence. Who are we? Are we French or are we British? And to what degree are we going to stay French? And to what degree are we going to become British? Well, and just like in society today, there are those who cling to the old, and there are those who want the new. Out with the old, in with the new. Let's have a renaissance. Right? Change everything. The push and pull is what shaped the Quebec identity, and of course that consists like that happens today even, where like sometimes there'll be I think at some point in Quebec they had a law saying all store signs need to be in French. And someone said, well, I want in English. And no, not allowed. Okay. So right, Quebec is struggling. If they're surrounded by an English world, they know that if they don't try, they're going to lose the French identity, like gradually over time, especially in today's world. So that struggle of who are we? Are we French? Are we British? Has become part of the Quebec identity. And it's nice and rich. Closing questions. Naya.
Yeah, so it should be mandatory to learn French so that it's not just the people in Quebec, because yeah, like you said, they're like, yeah.
Right. So when Canada became a country, yeah, those considerations were in place. Okay, who are we as a people? And I think the decision was made. If you're going to do a bit of English, we'll do a bit of French, and then we get to know each other. It's language. Yeah, I think it's a very neat solution. And it works, in Canada, it works out very well. In Belgium is another example of a bilingual country. And from what I've seen from my Dutch perspective, there seems to be much more conflict in Belgium. Though Belgium never, the two parts of Belgium never tried to separate like Quebec has.
Wow, so like Canada's more successful than like Belgium, like.
Canada is quite successful. in many ways. Yes, especially in terms
That's
of
good,
long.
eh?
Anne is saying A. Anne is saying sorry. Yes, that kindness ripples through in everything a Canadian is today, I would say.